context of white supremacy, Gus T Renegade in for another program to share constructive information on what racism, white supremacy is and how it works. We are getting started immediately today. I did not think I would be doing another program about the so-called Atlanta child murders. Folks who've been following the very first program that was broadcast here at Blog Talk Radio with the context of white supremacy was with Mr. Chet Detlinger. He is the author of The List. He is a white male, and he was one of the investigators during the so-called Atlanta child murders, very much relative to racism, white supremacy. That was a personal interest of mine, has been a personal interest of mine. I think I've shared repeatedly. I lived in the Atlanta area, and it's just a real sad and ugly moment in history for a lot of black people. Because of that broadcast, I had a gentleman. He contacted me not that long ago and said he had conducted his own investigation, and he wanted to share some of the information that he found through his research. He said the same thing that I always say: hey, check me out. Don't just take my word for it. Look for yourself, scrutinize, and check my information to see if I'm telling you anything that's incorrect, see if I'm making up anything. That's the same thing that I say as we begin this broadcast. Investigate for yourself. And before I bring our guest on, I want you to take a look at the photographs. The photograph and the CNN video in the description for this program. This is another program. Open up a different tab so that you can listen and you can see the photograph and you can see the video. What I want you to do, when you open up a separate window or when you open up a different tab, play that video, the CNN video titled Wayne Williams on Trial. Freeze it at about the 29 second mark. I want you to look at the black male that's in that video, and then I want you to look at that photograph that is above the video. Look at the black male in that video, and then look at that photograph. We'll explain that as we roll, but I want you to take a hard look at that because, hey, Gus could be incorrect. I'm saying that's the same person. We will share the relevance of that as we roll in the program, but take a hard look at that. The table has been set. Look at that video and look at that photograph. Our guest for today's program, real privileged to have him with us to share very constructive information. And I'll say it again, check out everything you hear for yourself. Don't take his word for it, my word for it. Check the information for yourself and come to your own conclusions about what went down in Atlanta, Georgia, 30 years ago. Our guest for today's program, Mr. Cisco Streetlove. Mr. Streetlove, are you with us?
I'm with you, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
Can you hear me? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. Loud and clear. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of your Sunday evening with us. As I said, I'm grateful to have an opportunity to share information about this case with my listeners. Is there anything you would like to tell the audience, just if they're not familiar with your work, if you'd like to tell them anything about you or why you did this research?
I did the research because I grew up in Atlanta at the time, and I always heard contrary to what the state's case was, and I was inspired by a radio program around 2005 on a local show, and I always wanted to do a treatise on it or do a book, and that's what I've been doing. And in the process, I interviewed a lot of people, and that's where I came up with the conclusions that you're presenting now.
Outstanding. I guess where I would like to begin this program, as I said, this was the first program that I broadcast here at Blog Talk Radio was with Mr. Chet Detlinger, who you've also spoke with.
Yes,
and we covered his information on this case. I didn't know I was seeing people were sending me messages, and I was seeing stuff come up on Facebook about this case. I didn't know that CNN just did a documentary, 2-hour documentary on this case, Soledad O'Brien, going over the details, talking to victims and what have you. I missed all of that. I didn't know that was what was sparking all of this renewed interest in Wayne Williams and this case. If you have seen that documentary, can you comment on what you saw and why you think they decided to bring this documentary out now, some 30 years after the case?
Sure thing. With the last part first, it's customary for news outlets like CNN, if there's a historical trial, they will use archival footage because it's easy to do and drum up a documentary programming, per se, to air. And with this CNN documentary, it was so far beyond journalistic integrity, it was a joke. They omitted a lot of stuff about the case. They spun it so that, again, you could believe in the lone killer scenario. And it was glaring contradictions embedded within the documentary itself.
I guess for folks who didn't see that documentary, can you share some of the contradictions that you observed in the footage?
Sure. The biggest one was them using Robert Henry as one of the key witnesses. That's the gentleman that you mentioned. In CNN, they casually mentioned that, in the documentary, they casually mentioned that he had prior sex offenses. He is a registered sex offender.
Wow. Mr. Streetlove, are you still with us? Not hearing Mr. Streetlove. I'm not sure if he perhaps got disconnected or if we're having some interference. Oh, I thought I heard Mr. Streetlove. Are you still with us?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Oh, okay. Yes, I can hear you. Okay, so
okay.
The last thing I heard, Robert Henry, you said in the CNN documentary, they made a casual reference to him having some previous sex offenses, but
right. Yes, sir. And it was a joke that they broke this guy out, that he is such a compelling witness that he saw Wayne Williams holding hands with Nathaniel Cater. And, so many of the people that the prosecution, a lot of news outlets have spoken to, they have questionable histories. There's a lot of dirt that they have to bear.
You talked about the questionable integrity of the folks who put the CNN documentary together, and they have a whole website. CNN headquarters is in Atlanta, so
right.
They have a vested interest in covering this case. It happened right in their backyard. But this Robert Henry gentleman, you have his mugshot photograph from when he was incarcerated. That's the photograph. It's directly from the website for the Georgia State Department of Corrections. Anyone can access his information, and I'm giving you the rap sheet that they have. This is from their website, the Georgia State Department of Corrections. This gentleman, who's in the documentary saying, and he was a key witness in the trial of Wayne Williams, who said that he saw Wayne Williams holding hands with Nathaniel Cater. This gentleman, Robert Henry, number one, his ID number with the Georgia Department of Corrections is 0000422 Okay, you can enter that and you can go research it for yourself. I'm looking at his record. He was convicted. They have his crime commit date November 15th, 1998 for aggravated assault. He was convicted, crime commit date July 6, 1985, for aggravated sodomy. He was convicted, crime commit date August 2nd, 1984, rape. He was convicted, crime commit date August 2nd, 1984, aggravated sodomy. Convicted, crime commit date July 6, 1985, aggravated sodomy. Convicted, crime commit date August 2nd, 1984, rape. Convicted, crime commit date August 2nd, 1984, aggravated sodomy. You can go check all of this yourself. Available, again, Georgia Department of Corrections, their website. This is the gentleman in their documentary that they're pulling out as a witness to say, yeah, Wayne Williams, I saw him with Nathaniel Cater. He's guilty. Can you give, I guess, some more of your thoughts on what you observed in the documentary and why you felt it lacked integrity?
Absolutely. There was absolutely no mention of the child sex ring that was mentioned in 1981 through the major networks. That did not appear at all in the documentary. They omitted a lot of the victims that were key to the case, like Timothy Hill. The woman who mentioned that she saw Wayne Williams in the record studio with the scratches. Now you have to ask yourself, Wayne Williams is incarcerated. Why does this woman have her identity and her face covered up? What is she afraid of? And it's like the list goes on and on. It was just a joke. And then with Soledad O'Brien asking Wayne Williams about his CIA contacts and about him being able to kill people with his bare hands with, an asphyxiation move. That, too, is a joke because several of the victims, they were killed with ligatures, so he wouldn't have needed a cord to kill him if he knew that martial arts hold. And the victims that he was convicted of murdering, neither one of them, at least one of them for sure, was not murdered with a chokehold. And one of the investigators that, remember, Wayne Williams, he's officially convicted of killing 2 adults. So it is incorrect to label him as the Atlanta child murderer. Nathaniel Cater was killed, I've been told, with a ligature. They never found out how Jimmy Ray Payne was murdered. They just found him dead.
Can you share with our listeners, just to keep our confusion, what a ligature is?
Sure. A ligature is, it can be a cord, it can be a rope, it can be a sash. It is something that is placed around someone's neck. And when the right pressure is applied, they're strangled, they're dead, and there's a mark around the neck.
I see. Okay. I guess number one, I think that's key to point out, because Chet Dedlinger, when he was here, again, author of the list, and he participated in the investigation, he repeated that over and over on the program. It's linked in the description for this program, and it's in his book, if you get the list, that the incorrect use of terms was an extraordinary obstacle in this case. In fact, he scolded me for titling the program The Atlanta Child Murders. He said it is incorrect. He says he sends a letter out anytime that someone uses that reference, that title for this case. As you just said, Wayne Williams was not convicted. And in fact, he scolded me for saying that. Wayne Williams was never charged with any child murders. He was never even charged. To my knowledge, no one was ever charged with any of the child victims on the official list. Not convicted. No one was ever charged with any of the children on that list. And the list has 29 victims. He was only convicted, charged with 2, and they were adults. So words. And I guess before we move on again, because I think a lot of people that really sent up hairs on the back of their neck when Soledad O'Brien, when she presented the information about him getting CIA training and him having been trained to kill someone with his bare hands. And you said that really did not sway your view about this case because
the funny thing about it is that Wayne Williams, he's already acknowledged that he had some CIA handlers. And she made it seem like, oh, well, they trained him to kill. And again, like you just said, Gus, he was trained to kill people with his bare hands. Anyone who's trained to kill someone with their bare hands, they would not need a court to murder someone.
This case, very intricate. I think a big problem has been that a lot of people are confused. Number one, incorrect terms have been used to describe the case. That's number one. Number two, it went on for such a long time. Mr. Detlinger said that the Atlanta newspapers did a terrible job covering this case, as did the enforcement officials. Terrible job investigating this case. Tons of names. It's easy to get confused about names and forgetting names. You got an official list with 29 victims and then a lot of people on the periphery. So I want to try to give as clear a narrative of what happened as we present your information. And again, encourage people, do your own research. If you can get your hands on Chet Detlinger's book, read it. If you want to read The Atlanta Youth Murders and the Politics of Race, I've read that book. Also very interesting. Tons of information. Investigate. Check out the documentary. There have been several documentaries. Check it out. Investigate for yourself. I guess to start off, when I spoke with you before the program, you said that Atlanta is anti-kid. Can you kind of describe what that means for our listeners, anti-kid?
Yes, I grew up in the early part of my life in northern New Jersey, in the New York metropolitan area. And there were a lot of places to take kids, whether it was Coney Island, Turtleback Zoo, the circus, Great Adventure, Boatcraft. There were a lot of places that a family, you could take your kid and enjoy yourself. Atlanta, you're limited to Six Flags, and furthermore, when you're talking about back in the 70s, between the 50s and the 80s, I would say, when you had television programming, Saturday mornings and sometimes Sundays, it was kid time. You looked at cartoons before American Bandstand came on, or, before like 1 o'clock. And as a kid, if you were in Atlanta, you noticed, like, slowly,
Mr. Streetlove, we are not able to hear you. A little bit of distortion on the line, I think. We can hear you now. We can hear you.
Okay.
Last thing we heard, you said when you were a kid in the 70s, and then it went out.
Oh, okay. There were a lot of places to go in Northeast New Jersey that you can take kids to. In Atlanta, it was very limited at the time. It was Six Flags, and that was it. And it's mainly, Atlanta is basically a playground for adults. Especially the inner city back during that era. you had a lot of adult entertainment. You had a lot of business to be done, and it was a lot of risque sex shops that were along Ponce and Peachtree and Piedmont. That the city really catered to adults heavily and hard.
I worked, when I lived in Atlanta, I worked in a nightclub. My view would be that that is still true about Atlanta. It caters heavily to adults, and I would say it caters heavily to nightlife.
Yes.
Atlanta is notorious for strip clubs. Magic City is a strip club. I know I'm just telling the truth. If I'm incorrect, please call in and set Gus straight. If I'm telling anything that's incorrect, but Atlanta is notorious for strip clubs. I have been to Magic City. I worked at a nightclub. Those nightclubs network. You go to the other places. Strokers. It is known for strip clubs and pornography, and which is integral to this case. I mean, that's something that people should really understand and think about that. Anybody, if you watched the CNN documentary, or anybody else that's talking about this case, if they're not talking about pornography, homosexuality, if that's not coming out as a dominant theme in what they're saying about this case, in my view, they're leaving out major parts of this story. I want to get you to share your view, but this is Chet Detlinger's book, The List. This is at the very beginning of his book. He says, Cabbagetown has been a home for teenage boys who, along with some black male contemporaries, had been photographed in the nude having sex with men in a child homosexual molestation ring run by 3 white men now serving prison terms. The Cabbagetown boys pleaded guilty at ages 16 and 17 in the slaying of an attorney they allegedly had tried to pick up at a bar frequented by homosexuals. They are serving life sentences. Can you share your view? Because I think you said that was very important, that when people talk about this case, they neglect the importance and the prevalence of homosexuality and pornography in Atlanta.
Yes, and I want to make sure. Let me know. If you cannot hear me, let me know immediately.
Yes, sir. Not hearing you. On cue, not hearing you. See, hopefully I'll see if we can get the line corrected. Say something, Mr. Streetlove.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Okay. The Atlanta, it's basically a gay mecca, and it's been that way since the late 1960s, early 70s. One of the things that you have with homosexuality is not every homosexual is a pedophile, but a lot of them are. And
say that one more time, please, sir.
Sure. Not every homosexual is a pedophile, but a lot of them.
I'm not hearing you. Actually, I'm going to see if I can put you on my line. That will see if we can rectify the line going in and out. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. Once I hear from Mr. Streetlove, I'm going to see if I can just ring him and put him on my line, because I don't want there to be any extra unnecessary distortion. Nice, clean broadcast so people can hear. And again, evaluate for yourself. Don't take this for the gospel. Listen, evaluate for yourself, and that should be the case with every broadcast here at the C.O.W.S. Mr. Streetlove, are you still there? Still not hearing you. Still not hearing you. Very interesting. Lots of interference. Very interesting. Let's see. As soon as I hear him, I'll see if we can get him. I'll put him on my line and see if that clears up some of the distortion. For folks who called in, I see we have some folks I don't recognize that number, so I'm assuming these might be new listeners. I am going to take questions. Give me about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll go to the phone lines and let folks ask questions. Mr. Streetlove, are you there? Still not hearing anything. I'm going to go ahead and get that commercial, and I will give him a ring and put him on my line. Hang tight. Context of white supremacy should be a very important broadcast, and we will move forward. Hang tight.
He's back.
Actually, we're not going to take that commercial. I think he switched lines.
Yeah, I had to switch lines. I'm sorry about that.
No problem at all. In fact, I was going to ask, would you, because I can put you on my line. I can three-way you and have you on my line. Would that work better? Do you want to try that, or do you want to?
Sure. As long as can you hear me clearly now?
I can hear you clearly, sir.
Okay, that is unfortunately Comcast. I don't know what to say, and I apologize to your listeners.
No worries, sir. Do you want me to ring you on this line, or do you want to stay?
Yeah, this line is fine.
Okay. So let's make sure we rewind so we don't miss that. You said not every homosexual is a pedophile, but many of them are. Of them are, yes. Okay, you can continue from there.
And one of the things that a lot of women don't understand is there's a premium to have sex with boys. And this goes back like thousands of years. This goes back to ancient Rome. This goes back to the foundings of the Middle Ages, even parts of Japan and North Africa. They treasured having sex with young boys. And that's the clientele that a lot of the pornography rings picked up and flourished on during the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and I think this is just important. This is background information to provide context for what you're going to hear when you really start picking at the details of what was going on in this case. And a lot of these details left out of mainstream reports like what CNN presented in their 2-hour documentary. Just to add more detail to this, can you kind of share about some of the big players in this massive industry of pornography in Atlanta during the 60s and 70s? If we could flush out some names: Mike Phoebus, Rush Minshew, just as much detail as you would like to share. We already got Cabbage Town, just to add more detail to this picture. Sure.
We'll get to Rush Minshew, and he was a big player. I guarantee you that much. But in the 1960s, there was a man named Michael Phoebus. He was a Greco-American. He attended Georgia Tech, and he dropped out. He had a newsstand. He was a smart guy. He did the numbers, and he noticed that the pornography was the thing that was drawing his customers. He went on to found Pendulum Press, which lasted into 1973. He also had like these the little Nickelodeons. Have you ever seen
I do know what you're talking about, sir, but I suspect some of our listeners might not understand. Could you kind of explain what those are? They're these coin-operated machines that they had throughout the 20th century. And you put a coin in, you see a brief film. And a lot of times they would have, for general audiences, little comedies, cartoons. Well, what Michael Phoebus did, he put pornographic material, porno films, in these machines. Suffice to say, between the books, the publishing, and these machines, Phoebus made a fortune. So by the early 70s, actually 1970,
he ran the pornographic trade in Atlanta. And he would go on to basically run 40% of America's pornography trade. The one man, Michael Phoebus. In around 1970, he had a falling out with a guy, and to any Asian American listeners, this is the guy's real nickname, Kenny the Jap Hanna, who was another gangster and in the trade. He killed Hanna, and he went on to murder a lot of people. His ultimate undoing was there was an associate of his named Roger Dean Underhill. Underhill turned state's evidence, got Phoebus convicted. Phoebus, like a mad dog, he put out a contract on Underhill. This man broke out of prison, caught Underhill and another man who was a Gambino associate. This was like around 76. Gunned him down with a shotgun. Shot him to death. He's been incarcerated since the late 70s in like super max penitentiaries. But Phoebus, he basically had an empire built on pornography. He went on to funnel a lot of money, basically launder money throughout Atlanta. He invested in a lot of the media outlets. He had a lot of record companies, including several R&B acts at the time. He even rivaled Ted Turner and was allegedly on tap to purchase the Atlanta Braves if Ted Turner did not purchase them. So this guy, he was basically making a fortune around $500 million to $1 billion in 1970s currency rates. And
I'm sorry.
Sure. No, one of the subjects that his magazines had was child pornography. Phoebus really catered to child pornographers. And that's been at the basis of one of my theories regarding the case with the child murders.
For folks who are listening, again, scrutinize everything you hear. And you should have the same level of scrutiny when you watch CNN. Same level of scrutiny. But if you want to check more on Mike Phoebus, extensive back. You can read about his criminal activity. They have extensive material available on this. And if you want to get an idea of some of the things that he was publishing with regards to his pornography, web address www.badmags.com. If you put that in, and it's going to say this is adult content, click enter. When you enter, click on Pendulum Gallery Press, and you will get to read information. Mike Phoebus' name is listed. He established this company. It has pictures. You can go through and see some of the information that we're talking about. Again, that web address, www.badmags.com. Please continue, Mr. Streetlove.
Sure thing, sir. Another thing about Phoebus, he was known to throw parties. Big parties. And one of the things that I've really looked into is that I'm trying to say this in as tasteful a manner as possible. Child sex is a delicacy with these people. Phoebus had seed money and funneled it throughout Atlanta to various criminal organizations to procure kids to have sex with males. and that is where you get a lot of the child sex rings that were operating in Atlanta at the time. From what my research has, I identified 3 concentric sex rings. One sex ring was run by a white male named John David Wilcoxon. He was ultimately convicted around the same time Wayne Williams was convicted, but he was convicted of federal charges. Another player who may be affiliated with Wilcoxon was a man named Robert Lee Hutchins, a.k.a. Wyatt Earp. He was tied to the murder of, or he's been linked to the murder of one of the Atlanta child victims named Charles Stevens. The second ring was run by Thomas Terrell, a.k.a. Uncle Tom. He lived on Gray Street, just outside of Techwood Drive, or off of Techwood Drive. And he was affiliated with a man named Larry Marshall, and probably Ricky Hawkins. The third sex ring included this woman named Shirley McGill. She came from Miami. And depending on various reports you hear, it was a black man who was with her. Shirley McGill was white. There was a black man with her named Parnell Tram. They were also in the area where a lot of the victims lived. One of the reports, a report specifically from CBS, stated that Tram said to some other people that Larry Rodgers and Eddie Duncan were on tap to be killed, and bigger than they were found dead. And Duncan and Rodgers, they were 2 of the later victims. And then you have a number of contract individuals, independent players who've been linked to the killings. They include Jimmy Brooks, Calvin Smith, who sodomized and murdered Clifford Jones at this laundromat on Hollywood Drive. And then you have the case of Charles Sanders and the Sanders clan, who the Sanders, they were linked to pedophilia, and they're the basis of that movie, Who Killed Atlanta's Missing and Murdered Children, which was based off of a Spin magazine article chronicling the Sanders.
I want to give more information because if you begin to investigate victims in this case, both victims that are on the official list and victims who are not on the official list, but victims who were murdered in a similar style around a similar time as a lot of the victims who are on the official list, quote unquote, you will see a lot of patterns, and you will see a lot of evidence of homosexual activity, pornography, pedophilia, and connections to some of the people that you've named. Uncle Tom, Tom Terrell, some of the Mr. Wilcoxon as well. I just want to make sure that folks have a very clear understanding of the rampant nature of pornography, homosexual activity in Atlanta, which I argue continues to this day. As a former Atlanta resident, walk through Midtown, come to your own conclusions, count the number of strip clubs, come to your own conclusions, white and non-white strip clubs, come to your own conclusions about, whether or not that's true. But I did want to make sure to toss in, if you feel it's appropriate at this time, Mr. Rush Minshew, just to kind of hammer home how widespread this is, this practice of pedophilia.
In the mid-'80s, I was in elementary school, and my class, we visited Channel 2. Rush Minshew, he greeted us along with the female anchor. And I noticed, as we were walking away,
this guy had one of them, like, hard-on looks at me and some other boys. And bigger than day, it wasn't even a year after this situation, he was caught arrested in Atlanta with an underage boy and some child pornography in his car. And he was eventually, of course, he was fired. And the last thing I heard, he wound up doing some local programming in Pensacola, Florida, and I think he died around 2000.
Wow. Okay, so I hope people who are listening have a much better understanding, and as you investigate, you will uncover tons of this sort of information. If you read Mr. Detlinger's book, that's just one place I can start you off. Tons of it all over his book. In fact, his conclusion is pretty similar to what Mr. Streetlove is going to share with us. He felt it was some sort of child pornography ring. He said that in the book, and he shared that on the program. If you go back and listen to it, February of 2009, he said that's his theory. He can't, come out and factually say this is what happened, but that is his theory based on his research. And if you read his book, it's dripping with information about homosexuality, pornography rings, pedophilia, and a lot of the connections that the victims who are on the official list had to this sort of behavior. Before we get into some of the victims and evidence that shows that they were involved in some of this activity, did you, in watching the CNN documentary, did it give any sort of indication of the rampant amount of homosexuality that is prevalent in this case?
No, they didn't. No, they didn't. No, the documentary basically fosters the notion that Wayne Williams is this lone killer. And the problem with that is, to date, he's never been convicted of killing any kids. That's number one. Number two, here we go with the vilification of black males. How old are most of the serial killers, Gus, that have cropped up in mainstream society? They're in their late 20s, early 30s. Am I right?
That sounds correct, I believe. That sounds correct.
We're talking about a man who at the time, he was only 22, 21 years old, and he was 23 when he was convicted. So you're basically talking about a 22-year-old male running around the city, killing dozens of people, not just 5, 10, dozens of people. Does that not sound preposterous?
If anyone is going to make that claim, I would want a lot of evidence to substantiate that. Not saying that it's not possible, but I would want a lot of evidence. And the fact that at the time Wayne Williams was convicted, they didn't even have enough evidence to charge him with any of the children's murders who were on the official list. And at least I am ignorant. I could be incorrect, but my understanding of criminal law, it gets more and more difficult to accumulate evidence the longer a case goes on. The further you are removed time-wise from when the incident happened, it becomes less and less likely that you are going to accumulate more evidence. The first, I believe they even have a television program, 48 hours. That first 48 hours is critical. So if they didn't have enough evidence 30 years ago to even charge him with any of the children who were murdered in this case, it's going to be a tough sell to come out, even with Soledad O'Brien, and she is attractive female. That's a tough sell to come at me 30 years later and tell me that he did all of these by himself. You didn't even have enough evidence to charge him 30 years ago with but 2, and they were adults. But I could be wrong. And This is consistent. If you could share before we get to some of the actual victims, this is consistent. You said that they didn't really bring out a lot of the information around pedophilia, pornography, homosexual activity. This is consistent with what happened when this investigation was going on. Lee Brown consistently said, no, there's no homosexual activity going on. There's nothing sexual with these cases. This was a mantra when this investigation was going on. Is that true? And if you could share more detail about that and telling folks who Lee Brown is and how he was involved in this case.
Absolutely. Lee Brown, at the time, he was the commissioner of Atlanta. He was the commissioner of public safety in the city of Atlanta. Him and the police chief, George Napper, they were the top two crime fighters in the city during the case. In 1981, around March, April, when Patrick Baltazar was murdered, he was murdered in DeKalb County around Beaufort Highway. Dick Hand, who was the police chief in DeKalb County, he did an investigation, went to the media that the murders had a homosexual background. He's the one that tied in the Gray Street sex ring with Patrick Baltazar. There was a press conference that Lee Brown held shortly afterward. This is around, like I said, spring 1981. After the evidence with Tom Terrell, and there was another affiliate of Tom Terrell's named Larry Marshall, who was linked to a lot of the victims. Once this evidence came out, he holds this press conference, and it was on the ABC News of all places. Homosexuality has nothing to do with this case, absolutely. It has no bearing on this case as any other factor. So, yeah, there was a cover-up, big time.
I just also want to throw in, and again, investigate. I encourage folks, please investigate. Go out and read. I believe Mr. Streetlove is in the process of working on a book. When it comes out, I will be promoting it so you can get his material. Mr. Detling, I have 3 of the books are scrolling by. If you're listening to this program at Blog Talk Radio, go to the library and read information on this. James Baldwin wrote a book about it. Investigate and come to your own conclusions. But it also was consistent. When these murders first began happening, the enforcement officials consistently said there is no relationship between these cases. There is no connection. This was consistent for a long time until they got close to saying, okay, we got Wayne Williams. We think this is the guy that did it. Then it switched. But in the beginning of this case, that was consistent. There is no connection between these victims. Is that correct, Mr. Streetlove?
Yes. Especially what happened going into 1980 with the first 5 victims. It was the pressure of Camille Bell, who was one of the mothers that you see in the CNN documentary. Her and some of the other victims' mothers, they got together and formed this committee named STOP. STOP was an acronym, but it was basically an active organization to address the killings at the time. They got the police to acknowledge that, yes, there is a pattern, there is something going on here. And the problem, when I look at the case personally, there's 2 strains here. Number one, with Michael Phoebus getting ultimately convicted and sent away, his empire was basically dissolved. The money that he used to fund a lot of these sex rings dried up. There's a definite, distinct pattern that between that and the change in mayoral administrations, there was a pinpointing of victims to liquidate before Maynard Jackson got out of office.
And again, this is consistent with pretty much what Mr. Detlinger said. Slight deviations here and there, but same thing. Basically, his theory was the dissolution of some sort of pornographic, pedophilic sex ring. Same conclusion. And you spoke with Mr. Detlinger. Can you start to flesh out, if we start to look at some of the victims on the official quote? Every time I say official list, that's in quotes. If you read the description, it's in quotes. The official list, quote unquote. Can you start to flesh out some of the evidence that you've uncovered to show how these children were, or excuse me, some children, some of them not children, but the victims were involved, and there was a lot of evidence of homosexual activity and or association with individuals who were engaged in pedophilia and or homosexual activity?
Sure. Shirley McGill and Parnell Tram, they lived around Techwood and in that area at the time. They were linked to, like I said, Eddie Duncan and Larry Rodgers. The fact that Mr. Tram mentioned those two and they wound up dead, that's one of the big things that links his organization to those two victims. John David Wilcoxon, he was linked to, he was basically accused of sleeping with list victims Earl Lee Terrell and Luby Jeter. Robert Lee Hutchins, a.k.a. Wyatt Earp, he was linked to the murder of Charles Stevens, and this guy was a known pedophile. He would go, I guess he called himself Wyatt Earp, that's some homoerotic joke, like the Village People cowboy. He would go into the city to have his sex and drug binges and actively find underage kids to molest. Tom Terrell and Larry Marshall, they were linked to 11 victims that were on the official list, including Patrick Baltazar, Jojo Bell, Timothy Hill, Eddie Duncan, and Patrick Rodgers. Patrick Rodgers, he was one of the last teenagers that was found dead around 1980. Ricky Hawkins, he's currently incarcerated in the state of Georgia. He was interrogated by the police, and he was known to have relations with a lot of the eventual victims. The authorities haven't said who he was linked to, but he was a known suspect in addition to Wayne Williams. Jamie Brooks and Calvin Smith, they're linked to the murder of Clifford Jones. And when you get into that story, how they just cavalierly sodomized and strangled him, that's a tale in and of itself. And Charles Sanders and his brothers and father and uncle, they lived in Mountain View, Georgia. Again, he was linked to Luby Jeter and I think Earl Lee Terrell as well.
Just some of the folks, if you're listening in, so you get an idea of people have asked me in all the programs that I've done if any of the material ever bothers me. Most of the time it does not. This is one of the few that really bothers me. It bothered me when I had Chet Detlinger on the program. It's bothering me now. When I first began researching this tragedy when I lived in Atlanta, it bothered me then. This one really, it just really aggravates me. But just so you can get an idea, some of the victims, Earl Terrell, you listed as having contact with some of these folks who are engaged in pedophilia, pornography. Earl Terrell.
Yes. He was the little boy. And Uncle Tom Terrell is the 63-year-old. There's something I have to mention about Tom Terrell.
Mm-hmm.
There's a character in Fat Albert, who I think his name was Mudbone or Mudfoot, and he lived in this old shack. And the Cosby Kids and Fat Albert, they would always hang out with him. That's kind of sort of how Tom Terrell looked. He was clean-shaven, but he kind of looked like that guy, and it's something about older guys like that. I think that the kids, they may have been lured by him, and he literally lived in a shack, just like that character in the Fat Albert cartoons lived in. And so I guess that's one of the ways that he unfortunately lured his victims. And the mystery surrounding him is that when you look at Tom Terrell, he was like, this guy, he's so uncouth, you can't be serious. But there was a lot of evidence that he took some compromising photos with a lot of the victims. This evidence mysteriously vanished. He was not officially mentioned during Wayne Williams' trial as a viable suspect. His house mysteriously burned to the ground, both properties. He had 2 homes in the area. One was a nondescript house, but he lived in, just like Chet Edlinger stated and just like they reported on ABC News at the time, he lived in this run-down, horrible, brown-colored, dingy shack. And this is where a lot of the pedophilia, the homosexual activity took place in his house. There was an eyewitness named Jerry Thornton at the time. He was a roommate of Larry Marshall. For whatever reason, Larry Marshall left Atlanta, and he was caught attempting to rob someone in Connecticut. He was extradited back to Atlanta, and that's where a lot of the story came out with him and Gray Street. And what it seemed like, Larry Marshall, he was basically like managing the sex ring for Terrell, because he was convicted of running, as they say on the news program at the time, running a house of prostitution. And Terrell, he just wasn't, he was like, I'm not also the ring owner, I'm also a client. So he was sleeping with the kids. In particular, he slept with one of the murder victims named Timothy Hill.
I just want to give out the ages of some of these victims so that you all can kind of think through this. And why I said this really bothers me, this case, every time that I have to pick up and do any research on this. Ruby Jeter, you mentioned having connection with some of these individuals, 14 years old. Earl Terrell, having connection with some of these individuals, 11 years old. Angel, make sure I get the Angel Lanier, 12 years old. Anthony Carter, 9 years old. Ruby Jeter, 14 years old. Patrick Baltazar, 11 years old. Timothy Hill, 13 years old. These aren't even the young. Yusuf Bell is 9 years old. Very young, some of these kids. Very young. And just, I mean, anyway. Also, just the amount of evidence that you will find. As I said, if anyone is talking about this story, talking about this case, presenting their theory on what they think happened, regardless of their view on whether Wayne Williams is guilty or innocent, if they are not talking about the rampant, and I mean piles of evidence and material showing homosexual, pornographic, pedophilic activity in relation to this case, I suspect they are either ignorant or they are deceiving you about what happened in this case. I could be wrong, but I mean, it's just too much to ignore this element of the story. And this, you can read this, True TV, they have a huge write-up on this case. This is directly from their website. Police learned of a child pornography ring that was operating right across the street from a South Bend Park pool where Earl Terrell was last seen. Earl Terrell, 11-year-old victim. John David Wilcoxon, I think you've already heard that name in this program, was convicted when police found thousands of photos of children pornographically displayed. Police dismissed the connection between Wilcoxon and Terrell because the photos were of white boys. But a witness claimed that Earl Terrell had been to Wilcoxon's house several times. Also, there was some disagreement as to whether the photos were actually all white boys or not. I found that really key when Mr. Detlinger was on the program in February of 2009. He said that there was another individual. He didn't give the name, but he said there was another individual who was arrested at the same time that Wayne Williams went to jail, and they found tons. You can go back and listen to the broadcast. He said that they found tons of pornographic material in his home. Tons of
Tom Terrell. Yes.
Thank you, sir. He said that when they went to go through all those photographs after they had taken the evidence into the police station, about half of the photographs were missing. They don't know what happened to them, never got an opportunity to check through to see if some of the victims in this case were photographed in the evidence that they collected. But he said that on the program. That's why I said there's tons of this stuff. Even some of the people who are not on the official victim list. Cynthia Montgomery was 14. She was strangled to death. There was evidence that she was involved in some sort of prostitution ring at 14. She did not make the official list, but there's evidence that she had connection to some of the victims. Did you want to share your thoughts on anything that I've just read, or?
No, you're right on point, sir. It's a rampant cover-up that, I mean, Mr. Detlinger, he's afraid to say it. I've talked to a lot of people that are afraid to say it, but it was people in Maynard Jackson's administration that were pedophiles. And they did not want to face any recrimination. They did not want to get in trouble with the law. Remember, his administration, he served 2 terms. In Atlanta, you can only serve 2 terms. So when his administration was over, that went their clout. And that's one of the impetuses of the killings.
I want to ask you about one of the victims and if they had a key that might be of some interest to the Maynard Jackson administration. But before I get to that, if it's okay with you, a lot of people have called in and seem to have questions. If it's okay with you, I'd like to go to the phone lines and take some of the questions from folks who called in. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let's see. Person who called in, last 4 digits, 4606. 4606. Your line is open if you have a question.
Hi, Gus. This is Erica. I'm calling to find out, I didn't hear it mentioned yet. Did you all know that Jack Mallard put out a new book? It's called The Atlanta Child Murders Night Stalker. And if you had an opportunity to read that, and what is your view on that book?
I have no desire to read anything that Jack Mallard says because he has tunnel vision, number one. Number two, the guy's a goober and he's a crook. And he's one of the problems with society. He's falling in line and spinning this nonsense that you have this one lone killer, and this is just not credible.
I have not read Mr. Mallard's book, and Mr. Mallard, he was the prosecutor in the Wayne Williams case. I have not read his book, but I am aware that he has done a book on this. I would be willing to have him come on the program because I would have a lot of questions. I don't know if people are aware of this, but Wayne Williams and his trial, Mr. Mallard and the prosecution, they used evidence from 10 cases
that they had no right to use.
That Mr. Williams was never charged with. I want to make that very clear so folks don't miss it. Mr. Detlinger spoke to this as well. It is constitutional. White people say this is okay, but Mr. Detlinger, he shared his view on the program. He did not think that this was a correct thing to do, a just thing to do. But let me say that again so it is very clear. Mr. Mallard and the prosecution in the Wayne Williams case, they used evidence from 10 of the victims that Mr. Williams was never charged with, but they used evidence from those cases to convict Mr. Williams. Think about that. You can investigate it if you think I'm making this up or what have you, but I would love to have Mr. Mallard on the program. Erica, if you had another question, feel free. Your line should be open if you have another question you'd like to ask.
No, that was all I wanted to know. Did you all get an opportunity to get into his book about the Atlanta child murders? I was thinking that maybe that inspired Soledad O'Brien to even do her documentary. I wasn't sure if they even touched upon that in the documentary because I did not get an opportunity to see it. But I definitely appreciate Mr. Streetlove's view on the child pornography ring because I think that is often overlooked, and that's a big element, if not the full element, of the case.
I appreciate it, ma'am.
Thank you, Erica. Erica, she contacted me when I had Mr. Detlinger on the program a year ago, more than a year, about a year and a half ago, and she had questions for Mr. Detlinger, and she said, let me know if you're going to do another story on this. And I think I told her, I don't think I'm doing any more on this. I'm really focused on white supremacy, but here we are. Thank you for calling in. Let me know if you have other questions. Mr. Nero, did you have any questions? If so, Mr. Nero, your line is open. Oh, we lost him. Perhaps he'll call back in if he has any questions. I can get him. Person called in last 4 digits, 5128. 5128. Did you have a question for Mr. Streetlove?
Not so much a question, Gus, but as I'm listening, I can really only think of 4 words: war on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for listening in. And Irritated Genie, author of War on the Horizon, the White Sex Assault, he will be back on this Friday, July 9th. Showtime is 7 p.m. Eastern, but Irritated Genie, he will be back this Friday. Let's see. Non-Mightywick. Non-Mightywick, did you have a question for Mr. Streetlove? Non-Mightywick, your line is open.
No question at this time, Gus. I did want to thank the guests for coming on and sharing constructive information about this. Very interesting to listen to.
Sure, you got it, sir.
Thank you for listening in, Non-Mightywick. Person who called in last 4 digits, 3439. 3439. Your line is open if you have a question.
Yes, now I have a comment. Yes, how are you all? Thank you so much for your research and your input. I'm one of the mothers that was living in Atlanta during the time that this was happening in the West End of Atlanta.
Yes, ma'am.
And I was not from Atlanta, so when I got there, I was just horrified because I had never seen anything like the black male homosexual community at night.
Ma'am, could you speak up a little bit? Your volume is a little low.
I had never seen anything like that before in my life, seeing black men as homosexuals. So I was totally in a different world, coming from a different world, entering into a different world. and I had my 2 children with me. And, so many bad experiences that I had there. It was like, this is when Stone Mountain was Ku Klux Klan, Maynard Jackson was, the mayor, and it was also like Hunter Street was like the Black Hollywood. So at night, when we would go to Hunter Street, all the black males would be out there dressed as women. And it was just like something that I had never seen before. So we never knew why these young children were getting killed, but from my understanding, Wayne Williams didn't do it, and then with all the research that was going on before I packed up my 2 children and left, the bottom line was they had decided that it was somebody from the Center for Disease Control that was doing some type of research studies and was blaming it on the homosexual community. But we all knew that Wayne Williams didn't do it, and I'm not even sure to this day if anything has been followed up on the Center for Disease Control, because what they didn't tell people, unless you were there, that a little piece of their penises were missing, just a little cut out of it were missing, and that the only person that was killed that was a female was one little girl who happened to have a short haircut, and they knew by this that she was mistaken as a boy. So, like, with all this new information that was going around, and then they just put everything on Wayne Williams, and then it seems like after that the research just stopped, and he was just a fall guy. Now, I don't know, is he still in prison?
Yes, ma'am. He's still incarcerated.
Well, it's a wonderful job you all are doing, to try to get to the bottom of it, but I hope those are some more missing pieces to the puzzle that will help you in your endeavor.
You helped a lot, ma'am, and let me, I'll say about the CDC, I talked to one of the investigators. That individual informed me that there were no mutilations of the victims. That was started by Dick Gregory. To date, we don't know where he got his information from. The best I can say is that the investigator informed me that there were no signs of mutilation. What happened if it's a male organs, as cartilage, muscle is soft tissue. When your body decomposes, just like your nose, your lips, that stuff goes too. What it seems like was going on at the time, they were murdering the victims at the rendezvous points. Do you understand what I'm saying, sir?
When you say murdering the victims at the rendezvous point, just break that down for folks who are listening.
Sure.
They're very clear.
They, at the time of the murders, according to some of the investigators I spoke to, there was no sexual activity present on the victims. Bernard Haley goes into a case of a killing of a little boy where the little boy was molested in his book, a case in England, I believe it is, where they did find that this little boy was sodomized and murdered, and there was evidence uncovered in his anal region. That didn't occur here. What it looks like is these were, unfortunately, victims in a sex ring. They had sexual relations with these people. But when they were ultimately murdered, when they went to hook up, it's like, the best way I could put this, the most tasteful way I could put this is, let's say you have a heterosexual prostitution ring, okay? Let's say Gus and I are pimps. Perish the thought. We have a stable of 30 women, ages ranging 15 to 28. Now, of those 30 women, 15 of them are murdered. At the time of the murders, when they're killed, they were known to visit specific Johns, but at the time of the murder, there was no sexual activity. They were just strangled, stabbed, maybe one was shot. So what I'm saying to you is that the victims, they were known to go to some individuals, but when they met them at the last point, that's when they were murdered. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard thing to imagine because we're not deviants and we're not killers. And so it's hard to say that, lay out how it occurred. But that's the case. They were going to meet the Johns, and that's when they were murdered. And before I continue, Gus, I want to make it clear to people why Atlanta and why no other city, if that's okay with you.
Feel free.
Okay. One of the big things with this case, and for people that you need to understand about Atlanta is a major, major transportation and commerce hub. Atlanta sits in the northern sector of Georgia. Atlanta has the airport and the highway system, so you can easily commute around the city and throughout the South. Now, Atlanta, as it sits in Georgia is like at the center of a star. It's like a star point. To the north and the east, you have the Carolinas, a sliver of North Carolina. Then you have the bulk of South Carolina that borders Georgia. To the northwest, you have Tennessee. To the west, you have Alabama. To the south, you have Florida. So Atlanta is a primary point, and it's a major commerce and transportation hub for a wide radius. Furthermore, in the 1970s, going even into the 1980s, when you're talking about Atlanta, you're talking about the end-all, be-all of the South. It was the biggest city in the Southeast at the time. And, Baltimore, Washington, they don't count. They're in the Northeast. Houston and Dallas, they're in the Southwest. So when you're talking about the traditional South, Atlanta, it was the only city with an NFL team, the only city with Major League Baseball team, the only city with an NBA franchise that it had all three simultaneously. You had a lot of conventions in Atlanta during this era that, now you have conventions in Las Vegas and Orlando. A lot of them were in Atlanta. So Atlanta was a big hub of the hospitality trade, the hotels, motels, what have you. That's a big part of having a sex ring in action. The hospitality trade, you have to have motels, hotels as rendezvous points because, if you're a male and, chances are if you're a rich white guy back then, or even a rich black guy, you didn't want to bring in some little boy off the street from Techwood, and this happened all too often. They would meet up at the hotels and motels, do their thing in the rooms, then they would drop them off back at the projects. So you look at Atlanta geographically, you look at what was going on in the city at the time, that's one of the reasons why you had the gay community really have a foothold in Atlanta as compared to Charlotte, as compared to even Miami. Gay men, they like sports too. You didn't have a basketball team in Miami back then. You didn't have you didn't have a Major League Baseball franchise back then.
Very important. Very important. I'm glad you shared that. I wanted to get one other caller, and then I want to make sure that you hammer that home about the transportation, because you said that's real important to understanding this case, why it happened in Atlanta, and understanding the geography of how the bodies were dumped, where victims were found, that sort of thing, and understanding that. Mr. Nero, did you have a question, sir? We got you back, Mr. Nero.
I am too disturbed to formulate a coherent question.
Fair enough.
Understand.
Ooh,
You got it.
If you get clear and you have a question, feel free to just tap 1, and I'll get you on the line if you want a question. It is disturbing. I totally understand. Yeah. As I said, this is one of the few incidents that I have researched to do a program about. That it really disturbs me to have to look at this. It's extraordinarily bothersome. It disrupts my sleep, and I mean that's happened repeatedly. Even when I lived in Atlanta and began to research this case, it would really disturb my sleep at night. Cree did type in a question. I want to get her question. Counter-racist evolving engineer. Her question is, if a child is murdered, wouldn't it be standard procedure to examine the child's body for evidence of sexual abuse? In a young boy, wouldn't that be evident even in a rectal examination, even if the penetration occurred weeks to months previous to the murder? Can you speak to that, Mr. Streetlove?
Sure. They did not care back then. You have to. A lot of people. One of the things that you have to understand about this case is that homosexuality was taboo back then. You did not discuss it, and pedophilia, that really was off limits. They didn't even use the term pedophilia when they were talking about it in the newscast. It was men or boys exchanging sex with men. That was the ongoing phrase. You did not have a lot of cases during this era where you had children who were murdered and it was pedophiles that were definitely at fault. There are only 2 cases in modern American history that predated this case that came to national attention. One was the Candyman case with Dean Corll in Houston, and he had some teenage accomplices. These were predominantly white victims. He basically was sodomizing and then murdering these boys. That happened around 1973. There was a case in Oakland County, Michigan, where you had 5 white kids that were murdered. And, there was rumors that they were sodomized, but for the general public, the sodomization, homosexuality, that never came up in the case. You just found these white kids that were murdered. That case, I think, was just solved around 2007, 2008. This case here, another thing I want people to understand very clearly, there was mutual benefit for the gay community as well as for the FBI to go with the line of the lone murderer. For people that were around during that decade, because the early 80s, that's an extension of the 70s, you had COINTELPRO, you had J. Edgar Hoover, that were basically, they had anti-black practices with the FBI. In the late 70s, you had the conservative movement. Ronald Reagan was swept into office. George Bush is his vice president. What better way than to clear up the FBI's relationship with Black America, and what better way to say that, yes, we're going to get tough on crime, than to corral a lone black serial killer preying on black victims in Atlanta. Do you understand what I'm saying? Perfectly, yes, sir. That's I do not want people to overlook that. And there's another point that there's an element of nihilistic behavior when you're talking about these sex rings. This was in an era where you had the Cold War, whether, they knew that it was a ploy or not. One of the things with these guys is that they were working like there was no tomorrow. They just did not want to quit until, they're like, hey, I'm not going to get in trouble for this killing. So with a lot of the sex rings in the 70s and 80s that you hear about, these guys, they basically dug into these kids like, I'm going to do this because, hey, we could all go to hell with the nuclear bomb. So there's a sense of nihilism, and it emanates from the Cold War. That's why during this era, you had a lot of the communes, you had a lot of cults. It's not outlandish now, and it wasn't outlandish back then. You really had like cases like the Moonies, for example. Reverend Sun Yat Moon, he owns one of the Washington newspapers now. They had the Moonies, and you would continually have parents trying to abduct their kids out of this cult and have them deprogrammed. You had Jim Jones. You had him lead his followers to Guyana, where they had Jonestown, and they were ultimately murdered in this massive suicide procedure. So you have this nihilistic behavior because one of the overwhelming thoughts in American society back then is that there was no tomorrow. We could go at any time. It could be the end of the world. The Soviet Union and the U.S. could wipe each other out with nuclear bombs, so we need to do this right now. That's another element that you really need to drive home when you're talking about these sex rings.
Wow. I also wanted to make sure I pointed out, you talked about the lack of regard with regards to the victims, black victims in this case, to really underscore that this was not news. It's not like there was a media outcry when the first 2 or 3 victims on the official list, quote unquote, were found. That wasn't the case. CNN was not running in to do a story about this at the time. It took, as you pointed out, some of the victims' mothers forming an organization and complaining before this started to pick up attention. And by that point, you had more than 5 victims by the time that this became a major deal. Also, you talk about lack of regard for black people. Mr. Detlinger talks about when they found 2 of the bodies, 2 of the victims in this case, enforcement officials mixed up the remains of the 2 victims, where the DA was prepared to charge the enforcement officials with tampering with evidence. Total lack of regard for black people, which I think is a major component to a lot of the just total sloppiness with the way this case was covered, the way it was closed, the way it was handled. Who cares? It's black people. Who cares? And I think some of the black people at the time, that is exactly what they said. If the victims had been white, we would have had a very different, this case would have been handled differently. I guess
it would not have gone on. They would have jumped on it when the 5th murder took place. I guarantee. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sir.
No, If these had been white kids, woohoo, that were killed, they would have, by the time the 4th and 5th victims were murdered, you would have seen law enforcement act so quickly, they would have been over.
I will pitch, because Creasy also pointed out John Wayne Gacy. He was arrested in 1978 for the homosexual murders of 32 teens. 32 is a lot more than, well, not a lot more, but it is higher than the official list of 29 victims in this case. What would your response be that, police were either incompetent or unable to catch him, and he was doing the same things, and these were white victims that he was convicted of killing?
Well, the answer to that is that they were teenagers and they were gay. They were known gay teenagers and young white men in the suburbs of Chicago. That's number one. Number two, it was John Wayne Gacy. It wasn't a sex ring. There's a difference between one lone killer and a sex ring. And number three, like I said, the racial dynamic of here. You did not have, even though, yes, you have serial killers stalking black victims, you did not have that racial element with John Wayne Gacy. These were long-haired. As far as white Americans were concerned, they were castaway kids, and Gacy, he just had his way until he got caught, and he ultimately got caught. And if you want to split the difference between the two cases, again, they found remains in Gacy's home, and he ultimately was charged with every one of those murders. Here, again, Wayne Williams, he was charged with the murder of two adults, one of which they do not know how he died. Again, they do not know how, I want to say Duncan, but Jimmy Payne, they do not know how he died. But yet Wayne Williams is tagged the Atlanta child killer. So, yes, there is a difference between Wayne Williams' case, the sex ring, child murders, whatever you want to call them in Atlanta, and John Wayne Gacy.
Again, our guest for today's program, Mr. Cisco Streetlove, did his own investigation into what happened with the so-called Atlanta child murders, visiting us context of white supremacy. And again, just with regards to the rampant homosexual activity and pedophilia in this case, Nathaniel Cater, one of the adults that Wayne Williams was convicted of killing, Nathaniel Cater was a child molester. In fact, his own grandmother threw him out of the house because she alleged that he molested one of the children. That
was Michael McIntosh. That was Michael McIntosh who was thrown out. Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, no.
But Nathaniel
Cater, he was a known gay man.
Okay. But yeah, just it's rampant. It's rampant throughout the case. And again, I assert anyone who is not talking about this, and I don't care which direction they push. If they want to go and say, well, the Klan did it, the CDC did it, whichever direction they want to push, if they're not bringing up the pervasive amount of homosexual content in their case, in my view, either they are not giving you the full picture or they're attempting to deceive you about what took place with these killings. I did say I wanted to get back to the transportation bit because I feel that's real important. And you talked about Georgia and specifically Atlanta being a hub. You have easy access to a lot of bordering states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida. Can you talk about the role that had in not only why this would be a center to attract people to Atlanta? You already talked about it being a service industry, big business in Atlanta, but how that played out in terms of the geography of these killings?
Sure. Atlanta basically is circled with a highway system, the interstate system. You have 285, I-85, I-20, I-75, among other interstates. And it's easy to murder someone in Atlanta or in DeKalb, get on the highway and dump a body, in a more remote area, like, say, Sigmund Road in Rockdale County. And that's what was done over and over again in this case. And another thing, too, when you're talking about homosexuality in Atlanta, if you're a gay man, it's very easy to make money in Atlanta back then as it is now and not crack a sweat with your hands. Like I said, it's service sector. It's doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers. There's no heavy labor in Atlanta. There's no firm, core, blue-collar workers' unions. It's service sector, predominantly white-collar. So it's very cushy for a lot of gay men to live here as compared to other cities in the country.
Wow. Mr. Detlinger talks about that in his book as well in terms of the map. I think that was an integral part of how he came to understand the connections between the victims in this case, and just seeing where the victim's residence was, where the last place that they were seen, and where the body was found, and saying that, wow, there seems to be a connection. These people, the victims probably know a lot of the other victims, which is true, and just saying that you can extend roads and easily access a lot of these spots just driving along the highway that you're talking about. And he also pointed out enforcement officials, most of them never really seemed to grasp that, and that really hampered their understanding of what was happening in this case. Do you have a similar view on that?
Yeah, I do. I do. They just, you had a lot of people, they just didn't get it at the time. And, when you're talking about pornography rings, there have been reports, they really kicked into high gear around 1968, 1970. Why? Because of 8mm tape and the drive for Betamax and VHS technologies. You had snuff films. You had video distribution that was available on a more massive level in the 70s that you did not have in, say, the 30s to the 50s.
Again, the snuff films that you're talking about, that ties exactly to what we talked about earlier in the program. Mike Phoebus, pornography empire, and individuals like Tom Terrell, also known as Uncle Tom, having all of this pornographic material, photographs. Mr. Will Coxon.
It's like I mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
Oh, please, go right ahead.
It's like I mentioned to you when we talked, I think it was last night. If you're into pornography, you can make 2 times, 3 times as much money as you do in narcotics. Because sex comes easy. There's no barriers. You don't have to process drugs. It's just straight up sex, sexual activity. It's raw cash. It's right there, right then. That's why Michael Phoebus and La Cosa Nostra, i.e. the Mafia, or AKA the Mafia, they don't get into narcotics per se because they don't have to in the first place. They're in pornography. That's like the DeCavalcanti family, the Gambinos. That's why they're big time in, or they were during this era, in the pornography trade, because it's like the money that they made, man, you're talking about tens, hundreds of millions of dollars circa 1970s currency levels.
Wow. Wow.
That's why, yes. Yes, sir.
Oh, please, go ahead. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, no. It's your show, sir. I apologize.
No worry. I just wanted to throw in, and I want you to pick right back up. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure people heard that you can make 2 to 3 times the amount of money in pornography as opposed to drugs. So if you can think about the violence that is associated with illicit narcotics, think about doubling that income 2 to 3 times for pornography, and see if you think people might not be willing to go out and commit crimes or what have you if they felt anything might put that money in jeopardy. Please continue, Mr. Streetlove.
Sure. There was a turf war before the child murders took place, and, I came into research some of the documents. Some of them are online, some of them you have to hunt for. There was basically a turf war between a lot of the gay pornographers where these guys wound up murdered, fighting with Phoebus over turf in Atlanta. One of the federal reports came out. There was a guy who came to Atlanta from New York. They found him dead in the car. These guys, they'll fight tooth and nail, bullet and blade for their turf. Because pornography, that's the thing. That's why, like I said, and I want to reiterate, that's why the Mafia, they don't get into drugs per se because they don't have to. They're making a lot of money with the pornography. That's like the sex trade and porno trade with the Gold Club in Atlanta. That was a case in the late 90s, 2000. Oh, the Mafia, they had a big hustle with the Gold Club in Atlanta. So these guys, they're well-heeled, and, if you cross them back then as now, they'll kill you because they want that money to come in, and they service a higher clientele. When you're looking at, like, whether it's pornographic material or having sex with kids, that's what they consider a premium. That's what, that's a delicacy in these perverts' minds. So you have guys that, they're rich, they're pedophiles, they'll pay top dollar to have sex with any kids that these guys can procure.
Wow. I normally would allow people to hang out on the line and listen if the show goes past the live stream, which is going to be about 14 minutes. Not doing that today. This is important information, and I want to preserve the quality of the broadcast. If folks want to listen, you have to press your mute button because I can't have a lot of background distortion in the line. So you're going to have to press your mute button and be quiet if you're going to hang if you just want to listen. I want to make sure that, I guess if you can give a clear indication of your theory with regards to what you think happened in this case and how these two-tier child porn rings were running. This is your theory on what happened, so you can really make that clear for folks. And I think that would also help them understand when you say that you think the victims, what was happening was that they were being executed basically at the rendezvous point. So is that acceptable? Is that something? Okay. There's one person that did call in. I want to get him because this program is rebroadcast on his network, Mr. Scotty Reed, Black Talk Radio Network. Your line is open. Go right ahead, sir. Oops. Now it's open. Go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, Gus, and good evening, Mr. Streetlove.
Good evening, sir.
Yes, I want to thank you. Both of you guys have educated me tonight. I never knew that he was not charged with the killing of a child. This is new information to me, so I want to thank you for your research, and I want to thank you, Gus, for bringing him on. My question is that I heard some years ago that the Ku Klux Klan possibly was involved in the case, but that's not what I'm hearing from your research, and if you'd like to comment on that. And secondly, what's the premise of Soledad's program that she's going to do? I mean, is she coming at it at the aspect that he did it and he's the only one, or is she entertaining that there's possibly others? And I'll continue to listen. Thank you.
Sure thing, sir. Basically, her program was slanted so that she went to the lone gunman theory that Wayne Williams was the lone rabbit killer. Now, I did research into the Klan angle. That's not true. Here's the problem with that angle. There was nothing for them to gain doing anything in Atlanta. It's like I talked to Gus last night. Those good old boys, they didn't want to have a doggone thing to do with the city of Atlanta. They wanted to go to see the Falcons, the Braves, the Hawks, and that was it. It was like, hi, goodbye. You know, you had business in downtown Atlanta, the central business district, but white people did not invest time in Atlanta. That's number one. Number two, when you have Klan activity, you have to ask yourself, honestly, as logical thinking people, black or otherwise, would they have not done that in the early 70s as compared to going into 1980? The Klan, there was nothing for them to gain. And furthermore, during that time period in history, America was slanted towards the suburbs. A lot of people did not endear city living like you do now. So, you know, even in popular culture, you had movies like The Out of Towners with Jack Lemmon. It was basically, you know, like the city was the no man's land. You had Stevie Wonder's song, Living for the City, which basically it takes a very negative view of the city. New York was all but ready to be abandoned and defaulted. The extremist take on New York was John Carpenter's movie Escape from New York. So people had, especially white Americans had nothing whatsoever to do with cities. They just wanted to live in the suburbs, and that was it. So the Klan angle in this case, it does not wash. And when you're talking about the sex rings and my theory on what happened, there, like I said, the outfit that Phoebus was running helped to invest in these pornographers, these sex rings. That money dried up. Maynard Jackson's administration, it was going out of office. You could only serve 2 terms, that was it. Jackson, say what you will, he allowed a lot of sexual activity to take place in Atlanta. Now, with the killings, midway during 1979, 1981, the victims are older. They're 17 to in their 20s. When you're talking about a 2-tiered, 3-tiered sex ring with concentric sex rings, you have children lured to the ring but you also have procurers of these children. Some of the older victims, there are strong allegations that they were helping to lure a lot of the kids into these rings. Now, when the ring was being dissolved, there's strong hints that maybe some of the older victims or someone else was murdering the kids. But to quiet everyone, the 20-somethings were eventually murdered. And that's what I talk about, where you have, on one hand, a multi-tiered sex ring or operation, and then in the bigger scheme of things, you have these concentric sex rings that are run by individuals. It's the exact same thing with the drug trade. It's the exact dynamics. Except here, unfortunately, tragically, you're dealing with child prostitution.
Would there be a kingpin, either individual or individuals, who would be in charge of the entire outfit, or even the three separate concentric rings?
Yes.
Okay.
There is a kingpin, and I've already stated that it's someone who was close to Maynard Jackson's administration. Another problem with the case is there was a restaurant, this one little restaurant, Captain Peg's, and it's real funny that was in Soledad O'Brien's CNN piece. Richard Hart owned Captain Peg. A number of the murder victims revolved around Captain Peg's. We're not talking about Captain D's, which is a fast food chain, or McDonald's, which has franchisees. We're talking about this one restaurant. Mickey McIntosh used to frequent Captain Peg's, and he was, by all accounts, one of the big-time recruiters in the sex ring. Richard Hart had to have known by 1981 that there was nothing good with this guy being in his establishment. Wouldn't he have come to the authorities, especially when the going rate that Maynard Jackson and the authorities were saying you can get $100,000 if you help us solve this case? Wouldn't Richard Hart have come out and stated that, hey, something's going on with this dude in my restaurant and 3 kids in my restaurant, they were murdered, but yet and still no one ever got the reward money. So there is something fishy with Captain Peg's, Richard Hart, and the fact that you had a lot of victims all around that one eatery.
I know Mr. Deblinger, he devotes an entire chapter to Captain Peg's restaurant in his book, The List. And he has a lot of the same concerns that you have shared, that a lot of victims hung out there, a lot of known pedophiles and homosexuals hung out there. And he also, in his book, points out that there are flyers that Wayne Williams was circulating, and they had the address for Captain Peg's on the flyer.
Yes.
He didn't, I mean, that's not a smoking gun, but that is interesting that he's giving out flyers that have the address for this restaurant on his flyers. I want you to, if you could touch on the whole Pied Piper mythology and how that is cast upon Wayne Williams to make it look like this guy did it, even though he was never charged, much less convicted. He was never charged with the murder of any children. But I want you to kind of share your thoughts on that. But I did want to check Mr. Nero to see if he has a question. Mr. Nero, if you have got yourself together, if you have a question you'd like to ask, your line is open, sir.
Sure.
No, sir, not at this time.
Okay. Groovy. Thank you for listening in. Yeah, if you could kind of speak to that mythology around Wayne Williams as the Pied Piper, so to speak, luring kids in to be a part of his music enterprise.
Sure. The Pied Piper mythology goes back to, old world Europe, and, the Pied Piper, he comes into town to get rid of the rats. There are rats that have infested this little small town, and so you have the Pied Piper with his pipes. He lures the rats off the cliff to their demise. The town's people are grateful, but guess what? They don't have the money to pay the Pied Piper. So he says, okay, you're not going to pay me. I'll do this. What the Pied Piper does, he takes his pipes, gets the proper tune, and lures all the kids into oblivion. All the kids follow him, and the townspeople never see their children again. So when you have that classic story, that lore, that plays a big part in Wayne Williams and how he's viewed. So instantly, you have this guy, his music, and this guy, he looks freaky. Oh, he's like the Pied Piper. He's guilty. And one of the things with the occult realm that plays a large part in the sex ring, these people are obsessed with the music industry. If you look at music, it's the next thing to hypnotizing people. You can get people to dance, you can get people to move with music. Well, if you're a deviant, you find the right pitch, you can get people to do far more with music. If you're a man who's a sex fiend, you can lure women with music. If you're gay and you want boys, you can lure them with music. And so you have a lot of people on the peripherals of the music industry or in the music industry itself that are child molesters, pedophiles. That's like, it was Hotlanta Records, even though they showed the black guy, Michael Ware, on Soledad O'Brien's CNN documentary. One of the early owners of Hotlanta Records was Michael Phoebus. He had a big foothold in the record industry. I don't know if you're familiar. There was a singer, Lolita Holloway. She was on his record label, Ripple. You remember that song Kid and Play had, Ola A? That was sampled from Ripple. That was their sample. Yeah. And I interviewed I was supposed to go meet him face to face. A former business associate of Michael Phoebus. He has the rights to the music. And one of the things that the guy said to me, it freaked me out to the fullest. He said, yes, I get a lot of money from the samples and the rights, but I tell you, it's not as to what we got in porn. And it was like when he said that, it was like whatever hair I had on my body, it just immediately jumped up. And, when you're talking about it goes back to the money and that whole sex trade, the money that he was making, because like I said, he was a partner of Michael Phoebus. You could imagine how much dough they were raking in back then. And this guy, he really lamented that money is no longer there.
Wow.
But as far as like the kingpin, there's always been allegations surrounding the Bush family, and there have been tons of rumors surrounding Maynard Jackson. And, say what you will, to kill that many victims and, in that time frame, to close out a sex ring of any type, that is proof in and of itself that there was some big shots that had everything to lose if they were to be prosecuted or at the very least blackmailed, I should say, blackmailed by some of these victims as they got older.
Could you share, because when we talked, you said that one of the victims in this case had a key to a room that belonged to Maynard
Jackson. Yeah, according to the story, and I could be wrong myself, I believe it had to do with Eddie Duncan. He was found with, or like somewhere in his apartment at Techwood, he had keys to a room that was often frequented or that at one time it was held by Maynard Jackson. And can I take this time to share something that I experienced personally as a kid?
Feel free, sir.
Just so that people don't think that, that, oh, this guy is crazy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. When I was 4 or 5, I was in a nursery school, or actually when I was 4. One day, the head mistress took some of us boys, she took us out, we saw a play or an opera performance. We went to a restaurant. We got in her car and she drove us around like 2, 3 destinations. And my memory is blurry, but I think at one destination, old white guy got out of his house, looked in the car, and took one of the boys in his house. And he, of course, returned the boy. But I never forget one of my classmates. He was like, because we nodded off to sleep because we were out of the school for a long time, and one of the guys, he pinched us. He's like, "Hey man, stay up, stay awake." And so this stuff happens, and the people that are involved in this, you wouldn't believe.
Wow. I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you had more to share, please feel free.
Oh no, that was it. When people talk about this case, Lou Graham, the former chief of DeKalb County and one of the investigators, he's not crazy. Camille Bell, Yusuf Bell's mother, she's not crazy. Chet Dettlinger and the late Jeff Prude, they're not crazy. These people, they know what they're talking about, and this case, what they have sold to the public in mass is not what in reality it is.
I'm glad that Scotty Reed, I'm glad that he called in. He is the leader of the Black Talk Radio Network. And he said exactly what I talked to you about yesterday. There's a lot of confusion about this case. And he said, I had no idea Wayne Williams was never convicted and even never charged with murdering any children. Yet he is plastered all over the media, Atlanta child murder, Wayne Williams. I mean, just total confusion. And in my view, just I have to really wonder when I haven't seen the entire CNN documentary, but the bits and pieces of it that I have seen, I really have to question the exactly as you said, the integrity of the people who put this project together, particularly with when you're going to roll out Robert Henry with all these convictions for rape an aggravated sodomy, and, this is one of the main witnesses who saw Wayne Williams with Nathaniel Cater, also a child molester, and tell me that this is what went down. And please, anybody listening, go dig and do your own research, please. Anything that you've heard today, investigate. There are a lot of books. Mr. Streetlove shared with me, a gentleman, he authored Mind Hunters. I believe that's John Douglas.
John Douglas.
Correct?
Yes.
Yes, sir. That book is scrolling by. If you're listening at Blog Talk Radio, he wrote a whole chapter on what happened with the so-called Atlanta child murders. If you want to entice anyone to pick up that book, can you kind of share a little bit? If you read that chapter, can you share some of the things that he talked about in his book, Mind Hunters?
Sure. At the end of the chapter, he says for those detractors of the state's case, I'm basically paraphrasing what he says. He basically elaborates that for the detractors of the state's case, there is enough evidence, I firmly believe, this is John Douglas, what he's writing, that there would be enough evidence to retry Wayne Williams and convict him of possibly 10, 11 murders. But, he says, to those supporters of the state's case, Wayne Williams is not the actual suspect in the case, and these murders, there were several suspects. These murders happen all the time, and he finishes up by saying that the truth is unpleasant. It's very unpleasant. For people that think that, people like myself are outlandish, Gus, do you follow the NHL?
A little bit, not too much, a very little bit. I used to be more of a sports junkie than I am now.
Right. Okay, who won the Stanley Cup, right? The Chicago Blackhawks.
This year?
This year.
Right.
And who did they play? Who did they play? They played the Philadelphia Flyers.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
What state does our president come from?
If I'm incorrect, Illinois, I believe. He was former senator.
And what state does Joe Biden come from?
Oh,
Delaware.
You might have me. Delaware, okay.
Delaware. The closest big league hockey team is Philadelphia. When you have, like, for example, during Ronald Reagan's term in office, what team came to prominence? San Francisco 49ers.
And the LA Kings.
He was the former, being that Ronald Reagan, he was the former governor of California. He stayed a long time in Sacramento. Okay,
all of the LA sports teams were big.
Exactly. Okay, when George Herbert Walker Bush was in the Bush administration and on his watch, who won the Super Bowl? The Washington Redskins. He's a company guy. He's a creature of the capital area. During Clinton's term in office, who won the Super Bowl? The Dallas Cowboys. Am I right?
Repeatedly.
Okay, that's the closest team to Arkansas. Who owns the Cowboys? Jerry Jones, correct?
Yes, sir.
He's an Arkansan. And then when George W. Bush was in office, who won the Super Bowl? The New England Patriots. What is the home state of the Bush family? It's in New England. It's Connecticut. He's a part of the Yale. The New England Patriots represent the entirety of New England. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
These are the games that they play in plain sight that, people take for granted that, there's no coincidence. What are the coincidences of these events happening while these individuals are in power? And it's sort of the same thing with when you have serial killings like the Atlanta child murders. It's deception, and you have to look beneath the surface.
And taking time to dig. That's one thing. Actually, I'll save that. I want to make sure I get Mr. Nero's question. Mr. Nero, I see you have a hand up. If you have a question for Mr. Streetlove, feel free. Your line is open, sir.
Thanks for coming on the show, Mr. Streetlove. I actually didn't have a question. Just wanted to make a quick comment that I believe Soledad O'Brien is married to a white person.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that was, stated at some point on the show.
Well, Soledad O'Brien is not the blackest of sisters. When you talk about Sister Girl, I do not think that you will crop up Soledad O'Brien in your imagination.
Although she's done Black in America.
Yeah. It's like, what can you say? But when you're talking about entertainment and the media, you have a lot of homosexual people in the media, and so they're very closeted and they're not going to upset the apple cart. So when you have a case like the Atlanta child murders, unfortunately, they will not come correct with it. Because it's like at the time of the killings, if it had been revealed that, there were these multiple sex rings in Atlanta, the city would have been condemned throughout the South. And you're talking about these murders took place during the Reagan era and conservatism. Atlanta would have really been tagged as San Francisco East back then.
I think, I know a lot of people have not dug through and read this material. I know I have listeners who have commented publicly about their dislike of reading and so forth, and I know a lot of people have not went through to read the material about this case. People commented that they wanted the books closed on this case. As you commented, Atlanta, major transportation hub, major tourist attraction. They have tons of conventions. This is bad for business. People wanted this case closed so that they could move forward. It was having an adverse impact on business. People did not want to come to Atlanta for conventions. This got international attention. Can you kind of share your thoughts on how that helped expedite closing the books on this case, saying it was Wayne Williams and moving on?
Sure. If you have, what better way than to close a case with one lone killer? And furthermore, a lot of the stuff like, it's bad for business, it was the hotels and motels were complaining. Why? It has everything to do with prostitution. If you're a pedophile and you see some of these victims being picked off, you could probably say, hey, I could be next. And you have a lot of that going on in Atlanta back then as well as now. And so it was one of the ways that when you have a lone killer, it takes the stain away from homosexuals, and Atlanta doesn't have to have its good name tarnished and run through the mud. It'll all be pinned on Wayne Williams, and that's it.
Wow. I wanted to get to, because I felt this was real important, because some of the rumors popped up during this broadcast, and I wanted to make sure that you got the opportunity to debunk some of the popular rumors and so-called urban legends around this case. But I also wanted to, before we get to that, I want to make sure I don't forget my thought. You talked about with Wayne Williams, and in my view, some of this comes out in the bits of the CNN documentary that I have seen, how this neuters black males. Can you kind of share your thoughts on that?
Yes. This case alone basically like condemn black men for being angry. One of the key portions of the case was when Wayne Williams was on the stand. He lost his cool with Jack Mallard, and he basically said, "Oh, that's it. If you want to see the real Wayne Williams, you got him." And that will go down in history as the Perry Mason moment of the case. But he never confessed to anything. All he did was flare up and say, "Oh, I'm not going to pussyfoot with you. You want me to be a real man? You got it." Now, with black people, this was always portrayed as a point that, see, let this be a lesson. You need to keep your cool. But in reality, if you look at the actual raw substance of the argument, he was standing up for himself. What is he supposed to say? "Oh, yes, massa. You was right, massa," to somebody who wants to convict you? There have been plenty of white people who have lost their cool on the witness stand, but they have not been convicted. But just because a black person gets mad, even though there was never any evidence to pin him as the Atlanta child murderer, this was always the one rub that led to his conviction. Because he showed anger, not because he's a proven killer, but just because he's a black man that showed anger, this proves that he's a beast and deserves to be behind bars.
I've seen, they do the courtroom sketches from the case. I've seen some of those sketches of that moment, and they have him snarling and just, looking ferocious and yelling and pointing his finger like, "Oh my gosh, look at a savage is on the stand."
Right.
Yeah, and in my view, I would say I think the CNN documentary does a lot of the same things. Just some of the way that the camera angles, where they'll show Wayne Williams and they'll have a shadow of prison bars in the background every time that they show him. You don't see that when they cut and show Soledad O'Brien. The talk of the CIA training that he received. Just a lot of the same things, that this is just a total psychopathic savage who hated black people. And deserves to be in jail. And he killed all 29 of these folks. Every last one of them, he's responsible, solely.
Right. It's sad, but it's ludicrous. And it's a real simplistic view at another black male. The thing with Wayne Williams, I maintain, is that at the very least, he deserves a retrial. I personally have a hard time thinking of him as being guilty, and I've talked to investigators. The people that I've talked to, they said that he is not the killer. He had a relationship with JoJo Bell. He's very smart. He's eccentric, but he's not the killer. So at the very least, he deserves a retrial. But it's one of those points in time where you had a whole bunch of people playing musical chairs, and unfortunately, he's the one that was the one sitting in the hot seat.
Again, our guest for today's program, Mr. Cisco Streetlove. I wanted, before we get to the debunking of the rumors, I wanted you to share, because a big aspect of the trial at the time, I don't hear it as much anymore, but a big aspect was these carpet fibers that they said this is evidence. See, he was connected to the victims. It was Wayne Williams. These carpet fibers are super rare. Had to be him. Can you kind of share your views on the evidence of the carpet fibers?
Sure. The carpet fibers boil down to there was there was a specific green carpeting that was in the Williams household that was purchased in the early 70s, and it was out of circulation. The prosecution maintained that the carpet from, I believe it was the Wellman Corporation, this carpet was so rare, and it was the only carpeting in this neighborhood that Wayne Williams, he was clearly the killer. The problem with that is that whatever you get at retail, and I mean whatever anyone gets at retail, now as back then, it's not rare. It's not rare. What's rare is carpeting in upper income homes. $1,000 suits. Stuff like that. That's stuff that's custom made. That's rare. The carpet in the Williams household, it was not rare. And furthermore, the similar carpeting was found in the laundromat where Clifford Jones was killed. And the carpeting was also green trilobal-like carpeting. It was in Tom Terrell's home. So that's an outright lie that, oh, his family had this distinctive green carpeting and they were the only family. We're talking about Atlanta. Even back then, the city population was 400,000 people. Atlanta, by any imagination, it's a big city. You mean to tell me that this is the only family in Atlanta that has this carpeting? That defies logic, Gus.
Wow.
And, you know...
And...
oh, I'm sorry.
No, please, go ahead, sir.
Sure. It's just that the case, it was jerry-rigged from the get-go to liquidate a sex ring under the guise that there was serial slayings, that there was this lone serial killer, and look, we finally found him. Oh, it's a miracle. And the tragedy is over, hallelujah. We can go back to our regular programming, but in reality, it's a front. It's a horrible, grotesque, horrific ruse that was employed to get rid of witnesses to aberrant behavior that would have compromised big shots in the city, if not in the country itself.
For folks with those carpet fibers, again, and this case went on for a while. I mean, you're talking about something that started in '79 and went on for years. I would encourage folks, research, go online, check out some of the books. A lot of material out on this case. You can go out and get information for yourself. As Mr. Streetlove spoke to the carpet fibers, Mr. Detlinger said the exact same thing when he was on the program, that the carpet fiber evidence was total nonsense. And he said that, again, words were used very skillfully to make it seem like this was hard scientific fact when nothing could be further from the truth. And he also stated that this carpet, that they did not check how, like if you go to your regular store to buy carpet for your home, they did not check, was this carpet sold commercially, so that businesses, car companies can also use this carpet fiber. They didn't check that at all. And when you go check that, it was. So now we're talking how many hotels have access to the same carpet fiber? How many car companies would have access to this carpet fiber? And on and on and on. Just, you know, you got to go dig a little bit and research. And I also...
One thing I want to add, one thing I want to add to people who do research. Go to the Television News Archives, Vanderbilt University. They have an extensive program where you can rent videos, and they have a lot of clips of people at that time. See, before you read about Uncle Tom, see for yourself what this man looked like. See for yourself, the environment that was the city of Atlanta back then. See for yourself the housing projects, a lot of the despair that people lived, and you will get the idea that a sex ring, among other criminal syndicates, could really operate in a city like Atlanta.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I felt that was really important. You talked yesterday about if you keep people in poverty, it's easy to manipulate them to do things. And you were actually talking about this in reference to other tragedy of what happened in Guyana, South America with Jonestown, Jim Jones. And I think a disproportionate number of black people were victims in that tragedy as well.
Yes.
But in terms of being able to manipulate behavior, a lot of these victims, I think we've already touched on several times, they lived in housing projects, just real tragic circumstances. This is in Mr. Detlinger's book, page 263, where Timmy Hill, he's one of the victims in this case on the official quote-unquote list, where he said that Terrell, that was Tom Terrell, Uncle Tom, and another man gave Timmy Hill oral sex for $10 to $15. That's in Mr. Detlinger's book. It's easy to manipulate really anyone. If it's a child, older person, it's easy to manipulate them. Here, I'll give you $15 if you'll do this, if you are in an impoverished position. Can you kind of share your views on that?
Yes. Atlanta, it was, one of the things about Atlanta is a mass of glaring contradictions. In the 70s, it portrayed itself as a modern city. It was like, remember, this is the thing about Atlanta that a lot of people overlook. East of the Mississippi, you had demographically the American population in the Northeast and the Midwest because of segregation. When segregation was abolished, Atlanta looked good to a lot of black people, and it looked good to a lot of people because it was in the South. You didn't have to worry about snow. You didn't have to worry about harsh winters. So you can relocate from the Northeast to come to the city of Atlanta, and compared to New York City or even Newark, New Jersey, the streets are clean. The weather is so pleasant. But in the city itself, there were oceans of poverty. You had up until the late 60s, Buttermilk Bottom. That was a very destitute area. You had a whole bunch of housing projects in the city and around the city. East Lake Meadows, which was known as Little Vietnam, McDaniel Glen housing projects, the Bowen homes, the Grady homes, Perry homes, several housing projects that, Techwood, that if you did not live there, you did not want to be around there. I mean, they were very blighted conditions. People were deprived of the basic necessities. And it, like I said, it is so easy to operate a sex ring when you're a gay man who has so much more and you want that little boy from the hood.
Wow. I'm glad that you mentioned the Bowen homes, because Back of the Bus had a question about that. During the middle of this ordeal, the so-called Atlanta child murders, there was an explosion at a daycare center, and I believe that was in Bowen homes. That really, for a lot of black people, both in Atlanta and nationwide, they really felt that this is evidence, this is genocide, the Klan is out to kill black children. What are your thoughts on that explosion at the daycare center?
It could have been a diversionary tactic. One of the things that happened 10 years ago and is tangentially related to this case, Sidney Dorsey. He was a detective at the time of the child murders, and he fingered Jamie Brooks as the killer of Clifford Jones. To make a long story short, by the 1990s, he was the sheriff of DeKalb County. In 2000, he lost to his basically arch rival, Derwin Brown. He orchestrated the murder of Derwin Brown. Derwin Brown, he never became sheriff. He was, as they always said, he was the sheriff-elect when he was killed. The case broke because an associate of Sidney Dorsey was so cavalier, and he felt like him and his boss had such complete power in DeKalb County. He orchestrated the murder of a drug dealer who he had a falling out with. So when you have crime rings of this nature, there are peripheral killings, peripheral murders that a lot of the players employ as tactics to intimidate the populace. That could be one of the reasonings behind that unfortunate incident at the daycare or at the school.
To intimidate people who might be wanting to come forward and say something about this, or just to distract them, or to lead them to the Klan conspiracy, that the Klan is out there doing this. You think that could have been what happened there?
Again, Gus, who's to say that one of the kids who we don't know slept with one of these pedophiles, who's to say one of those kids wasn't the victim of that explosion? You understand what I'm saying?
That makes sense. I got you. Wow.
People, it's easy to go to the Klan. It's easy to, because in late 79, 78, there was a shootout in Greensboro, North Carolina, where some Klansmen, they did fire upon some civil rights activists. They actually gunned them down in cold blood and got away with it, but that was in Greensboro, North Carolina. In Atlanta, whites really, like I said to you, they had nothing to do with the city. Didn't want to have anything to do with the city.
This is right in line with the rumor debunking. When we talked, you said that was important. That was something that you wanted to take an opportunity to kind of point out some of the, as I said, quote unquote, urban legends that kind of go along with this case. That was one of the big ones. That the so-called Atlanta child murders, that was the Klan, that was racists, that was genocide against black people. Could you share your thoughts on that rumor?
Sure. It's just, it doesn't hold up. When you look at if one thing about the South is different from the Northeast and the rest of the country in that he who has the gold makes all the rules. There are strict social circles, and especially at that time, if the Klan wanted to make a statement against black Americans, they would have attacked a church. They would have attacked some college students. Again, all the victims, the young victims, most if not all, they're tied to pedophiles. Even if you believe the FBI reports, pedophiles cropped up in the case of the girls that were killed and are officially on the list. Atlanta was prime time for sex rings. It wasn't the haven for hate groups.
I think that's an easy one. And I can see how people can get kind of pushed off in that direction. Understandably, system dominated by racism and white supremacy. But it doesn't ring true to as I said repeatedly, anyone who's talking about this case and they're not directly addressing the rampant amount of homosexual and pedophilia I suspect they're either not very well informed or they might be consciously attempting to deceive you about what happened with these incidents. One of the other, and it came up on the program already, that these victims were sexually mutilated. I think you touched on it a little bit, but if you want to share a little more about that rumor, the sexual mutilation of the bodies.
Sure. According to one of the investigators, they were not sexually mutilated. And what happens is, if you're in a state of decay, if whether you're a boy or a man, your private parts, that soft tissue. And as your body decays, that's going to decay just like your nose. And then if there was any mutilation, it was wildlife that was nibbling on the appendages. And you know, your nose, your fingers, your genital area, wildlife they'll munch on that.
I also wanted to point out the caller. She said that there was one female victim, and that female victim had a short haircut like a male. That is not accurate. There were 2 female victims on the official list. And I've seen photographs of one of them, and she did not. She looks like a female. There's no way you can mistake her for a male. I'm not sure if that's accurate to say that the 2 females on the official list look like a male. I don't believe that's accurate.
Oh no, these sex rings they cater to homosexuals as well as heterosexuals. But like I said, when you're dealing with pornography, the money to be made is with homosexuals because it's the most exquisite of sexual appetites as far as they're concerned. It's the most rare. People understand male-female relationships, even inappropriate relationships, but to procure a young male for a man to have sex with, that takes more work than to have him with a little girl.
One of the other rumors that the laundromat, I believe the laundromat where the victim Clifford Jones was killed, that laundromat was owned by a white person, and you said that is inaccurate. Is that correct?
That is inaccurate, right. That there's been a lot of people assume that because you hear a laundromat manager, that because it's a manager, that it's a white person, but no. It was Jamie Brooks. He was a 29-year-old at the time. CNN made a big stink that, this guy passed the polygraph test, so he was free and clear. He was a sophisticated 29-year-old, and he was a major pedophile. He wound up in prison shortly after he was cleared of Clifford Jones' death because, like Chet Bellinger said to you, like Jeff Proof said, he raped another little boy. And he wound up in jail where he died of AIDS in the late 80s.
Wow. See, I think you touched on this as well. I just want to make sure everybody's got it clear. There, I guess, also is the theory that this case was intended to embarrass black people who the black Mayor Jackson, he's a black person, to embarrass black people who were in positions of power, quote unquote, that you don't think that theory holds any weight either?
See, when I first went into my research, I thought that was a plausible theory, but it's like, from what I've heard about a lot of people, including Maynard Jackson, they were probably singing Hallelujah when the case was wrapped up, and it wasn't about them being embarrassed all along. If you're a pedophile and if you know you've done some dirt and the person that you slept with was suddenly found killed, you'd be like, "Woo, my secret is safe." I mean, it's grotesque and it's ghoulish, but that's how these people think. They don't care about people. They don't care about people. Even little kids, they don't care about people.
Wow. I also wanted to get this out because it's very important to this. There are, just depending on how much you want to dig on this case, on the periphery, individuals who are also involved in the occult. And I think we had discussed that there tends to be a correlation between people who are involved in the occult and pedophilia. And I think even there was one home that was discovered in the middle of all this where they had a Bible nailed to the wall with some cryptic biblical verses. Can you kind of share about that and the occult?
Sure. In early January of 1981, some of the searchers came across a house, and this has been chronicled in a lot of news outlets, even in Bernard Headley's book and in the New York Times. So this is nothing that people make up. This is not hearsay or rumor. It was a house. It was apparently vacant, but a foul odor emanated from the property. When the searchers went in, there were children's clothes. There were tools, I guess like a pickaxe or a shovel. And then there was graffiti and a Bible, like you said, that was tacked on the wall. Now, they never publicly identified who owned the house and who came to claim the house, but yes, that really did occur. And when you're talking about the occult, and it runs parallel to pornography, because you have a lot of people who they follow Aleister Crowley and some other individuals. They think that this is them talking. I do not believe this at all. They think that it is precious to have sex with young male concubines. Crowley did it. It's called sexual magic. A portion of it was touched upon in the movie Minority Report. It's one of those things where they are on the peripherals of the sex rings. You have sexual magic to control people. L. Ron Hubbard was involved. A number of people have been involved in sexual magic. There was a guy, P.B. Randolph. Have you ever heard of him before? P. Beverly Randolph?
No, sir.
He was a black guy who was he was basically like a doctor and a vizier and a sexual magic practitioner who graced the company of Abraham Lincoln. I don't know if you recall that comedy. It was controversial at the time. Desmond Pfeiffer.
Yes, I do.
That was loosely based off of Mr. Randolph. And I mean loosely based off of him. And, you know, you have people that practice the occult that they use, you know, rogue religious practices to entice minors into sexual activity. There's a lot of books like The Vision and the Voice, The Book of the Law, the original Hellfire Club, that they practice occult rituals and they molest kids.
As I said, this case just really bothers me, and it should. I think anyone, if you start looking at the ugly details in this case, it's chilling. It's frightening, and I think just the actual evidence that's there trumps anything you can think of with regards to the KKK or anything else chasing, you know, these rumors that float around the case. Just going and studying what's there will be more than enough to chill and frighten you for days. Trust me. Man, I feel like we shared so much. If there's anything you would like to tell folks who are listening in as we close out, if you want to give them information where they can go and do some digging for themselves. I'm looking right now. They have the FBI file on the Atlanta child murders is available. It's in microform. You can go check that out. I see it's available right here at the University of Washington. Anything you would like to tell them?
Sure. Try and get copies of the list. Try and get some old archival footage so you can really see about Atlanta. Don't be so quick to fall for the official story. And, you know, you have to ask yourself, when you're talking about the black community, it's a running joke about Atlanta. And all I can say is these people didn't just crop up overnight. They've been here for the longest. And like I said, not every homosexual is a pedophile, but a lot of them are. I mean, I worked with several gay people over the years, and it is nothing. If you're a real man, it is nothing like a gay man pointing out a 16-year-old boy and say, "Oh, he sure looks good." And it's like, you know, it's creepy, it's not normal, it's not right, but that's the mindset that a lot of those individuals have.
When you're working on compiling a book on this material, when should folks be on the lookout for your work?
Try and get it. Well, it's pretty much done. At this point, I'm looking to shop it around early next year. And
early next year.
And if that doesn't work, I'll just self-publish it.
Wow. Is there a title so that people will know what to look for? Do you have a title for it already?
The working title for years has been Yesterday's Shame, The Atlanta Child Murders.
Wow. Definitely. Invitation to come back when the book comes out. Anything we can do to help promote your work, definitely want to do. Just let me know when you're ready to go to print, and we'll make it happen. We'll set it up and get the program done. As I said, again, if anything else you can think of, if you would like to share with folks that you would like them to know about the case or material that they should look into, or the CNN documentary, or William Scarborough's documentary, anything at all you'd like to share.
William Scarborough's documentary is a great source to look at. I would criticize the Atlanta youth murders and the politics of race. I think Bernard Headley did a horrible disservice, and this man worked. He took 17 years to do his book, and he was in Atlanta at the time of the case, so he should have known better to come with something more substantive than he did. The Atlanta youth murders, it's an interesting read, but it's not as penetrating as it should have been. And William Scarborough's book, Mind Hunters with John Douglas, try and get a copy of the list. It's a shame that that's not out now. It should be. But, you know, and just be observant, because unfortunately this can happen again, and like a lot of people said to me, it continues to happen.
Chet Dettlinger's The List, that is a very difficult book to find, and I told Mr. Dettlinger when he was on the program, I was in Atlanta, I was a resident there, and I could not find a copy of his book in Atlanta, that's a whole other issue. I had to come all the way to Washington State before I could get my hands on it. I have it right now. When he was on the program, he said if people contact him for $20, he can get you a copy of the book. I should still have his contact information. If you want to shoot me an email, I'll see what I can do. I don't make any promises, but I'll see what I can do. I believe I still have his contact information. But I would highly recommend that book, because, as I said, when you go out and start digging, everything that Mr. Streetlove has shared with us today, it's not nutty at all. It's pretty standard. Once you start digging in the material, there's a lot of evidence to support pretty much everything that he said. And as I said from the very beginning, Mr. Chet Dettlinger comes to a lot of the same conclusions that Mr. Streetlove has. Child pornography ring perhaps being dissolved for whatever reason, where you have a kingpin at the top, some procurers who go out and get these young boys for sexual favors for whomever, and that they were all liquidated, both the older boys that were going out and getting the younger children and the younger children, all tossed when this ring was being dissolved. So I would highly recommend folks get Chet Dettlinger's book. James Baldwin wrote a book, Evidence of Things Not Seen. A lot of material on this case. Get out there and dig, and just ask questions. You don't have to believe anything that was shared on this broadcast today, but ask questions. Scrutinize this broadcast with the same intensity that you would scrutinize what CNN presents, what's in the Atlanta youth murders and the politics of race, Mr. Dettlinger's book. Offer the same scrutiny, and come to your own conclusions. And please be mindful of words. Again, Atlanta child murders, man, a misnomer all the way. They got adults. You got 27-year-old adults on this list that they call the Atlanta child murders. And again, I say it as many times as possible, Wayne Williams was never charged with murdering any children. Never. In fact, no one has been charged with killing any of the victims who are on the official quote-unquote list. I hope the program has been of constructive value. I have enjoyed it immensely, and am just extremely grateful that Mr. Streetlove, who reached out to me because of the Dettlinger program and wanted to share the information. I'm appreciative that we were able to get it done, and that you were willing to come in and talk with us today, sir.
Well, I appreciate your platform, sir, and you're really doing your best to improve the community. And thank you once again, sir.
Thank you. We will be on the lookout for the book. The title, do I have it correctly? Yesterday's Shame, was it Atlanta Child Murders, or?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yesterday's Shame.
Yes.
The Atlanta child murders. We will be on the lookout. And as I said, when the book comes out, you already have an invitation. Come back, promote your work. I'm looking forward to seeing that material get out and seeing people read that book and get a better, more accurate understanding of the horror that went down in Atlanta 30 years ago. Thank you all so much for tuning into the broadcast. Did you have anything else you wanted to share? We still got 3 minutes. Did you have anything you wanted to get out? Mr. Streetlove, if you're still with us, did you have anything you wanted to share before we close? I just wanted to make sure if you had anything that you forgot or anything. Oh, okay, you might be gone. Again, thank you to Mr. Cisco Streetlove. We will be back later this week. Actually, Irritated Genie will be here on Friday, July 9th. Dr. Mwalimu K. Baruti will be here on Thursday, July 8th. I think they will both probably have a word or two to say about pedophilia, homosexuality, and if you haven't heard their broadcast when they were on the program previously, dig through the archives. Admitted white supremacist known as Tim Wise, scheduled to be here a week from today on July 11th. Going to work. We might even have a program before then, but we'll remain active. Please support the cows if you found the broadcasts to be constructive. Please invest. Donate button is there. I still do not have a MacBook Pro or a phone, but I'm trying to be productive. Support Cree's program as well, and her blog, cree7.wordpress.com. Again, cree7.wordpress.com, and back of the bus, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. My condolences, Sister Nefertari. Her grandmother transitioned over the past week. My condolences, and I hope she continues with her work. If you all want to check her archives, Irritated Genie was on her radio program today. Her website, ourcause.com, OURKOS.com. You can just look for her radio program and the archive. She said it should be up by the end of the week, but you can hear Irritated Genie. He was on her program earlier today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Thank you.